Hey everybody, you're at JMBE Live. My name is Rachel Horak, ASM staff member in the Education Department. Today's topic, we're going to talk about biology education research and a paper recently published looking at an overall view of the field at the current time. Before we get started today, we're going to take a quick look at a newly launched online course on biology education research that's going to be sponsored by both ASM and the Society for the Advancement of Biology Education Research. And let's learn about it right now. So our course is called Getting Started in Biology Education Research. The website I just put into the chat box, and it's with the course. It's a 7-week course, and you get free registration to the 2022 ASM Conference for Undergraduate Educators. There is an application process. And what are you going to learn when you come? Well, these are some learning outcomes over here on your right-hand side. You can see that the course is being sponsored by both ASM and SABR. And one of our speakers today, Stanley Lowe, is the president of SABR. Thank you so much for being here. And he's co-organizer of this course and also a course speaker about qualitative methods. We have a really exciting course planned for you. It's 7 weeks. And here's the topics listed here. And you can see we have a big diversity of speakers. New this year, we put in a topic about ethics for STEM education researchers, which will be hosted by the JMBE editor-in-chief, Stan Malloy, and Amy Koulis. Amy is the director of ethics at ASM. And included in the course, you get free registration to the ASM Conference for Undergraduate Educators because we hope that you'll form a community through the 7-week course. And then you'll attend ASMQ and view the biology education research posters, get ideas for your new study in biology education research. So if you have any questions, you can contact me at education@asmusa.org. One question that came through in the chat is this course related to the Biology Scholars Research Residency? And yes, it is similar, but seeing that it's only a 7-hour course and it's online, it's not as intensive, but it's meant to be a preview for people that previously did not take the biology scholars. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our speakers today, Stanley and Jeremy.
Great. Thank you so much for having us today, Rachel. So Stanley and I wanted to introduce ourselves first and share some of the work we've been doing looking at biology education research. So my name is Jeremy Hsu. I'm an assistant professor of biology at Chapman University. We're in Orange County, California.
And hi, everyone. Good morning. Well, at least morning here in San Diego. I'm Stanley Lowe, an associate teaching professor in cell and developmental biology, and also in mathematics and science education at the University of California, San Diego. So thank you so much for having us here today. And so what we want to share with you today is this particular open access paper that's been published in the Journal of Microbiology and Biology Education Research. And the impetus and motivation for that is historically, there's been a number of sort of top-down ways in characterizing the field of biology education research. So this includes, for example, right, the journal JMBE publishes articles that address good pedagogy and design, student interest and motivation, recruitment, retention, citizen science, faculty development, and institutional transformation, and describes itself as rooted in microbiology and its branches to other biological disciplines. And as another example, SABR, the Society for Advancement of Biology Education Research, was formed to promote hypothesis-driven research seeking to create new knowledge about teaching and learning of biology and to disseminate that knowledge to the broader scientific community, right? So these are called top-down approaches because in these cases, right, they are coming from professional societies or journals where perhaps a smaller group of individuals have gotten together and tried to make the best decisions on what would make sense for the society or the journal, for example. And another perhaps approach to this is to analyze existing literature and conferences. So for example, my colleagues and I published our papers a few years ago looking at the papers that's been published in life sciences education from 2002 to 2015. And as you can see, there's some trends in here that might have changed over time, right? There's an increasing, for example, the blue portion is a particular kind of studies that focuses on descriptive research, right? And then perhaps other pieces also that's emerging is the green part that didn't exist early on is a mechanistic research that tries to understand the how and why of biology learning and teaching. So this is sort of one example. We've also done some work in understanding the history and literature of, for example, a particular teaching strategy called process-oriented guided inquiry learning, and also looking at theoretical frameworks that used across STEM education research disciplines. And so I'm going to put the links in the chat here. But all of this work, right, either the top-down approach of characterization or analysis of published work, really focuses on perhaps a subset of people who are producing biology education research, right? But also increasingly, there is a growing number of colleagues, right, who may not publish in the field, but engage with the field in a variety of ways, such as, consuming or using the research or collaborating with colleagues in ways that may not show up in publications or in sort of professional societies or journal editorial boards, right? And so it is really important to democratize the process and really include the voice of additional individuals who may not have shown up in these other earlier analyses. And so I'm going to turn this back over to Jeremy, who was the lead author, first author on the paper, and he's going to talk us through all the wonderful parts of the work that we've done together.
Thanks so much, Stanley. Really appreciate that. So as Stanley mentioned, we had seen these previous top-down approaches coming from professional societies, journals, and small groups of people. But as the field of biology education research, or BER, continues to grow, we really wanted to be inclusive and hear everyone's voice in this process. And particularly given the relatively nascent status of the field, we wanted to have a chance for us as a community to really reflect upon who we are as a field, who we are as a discipline, and to hear from everyone what they perceived as the goals, questions, and scholarly work in the field. And so as Stanley mentioned, we wanted to complement this top-down work by adding these additional voices. And to our knowledge, this is the first attempt at this bottom-up model, meaning having ideas and questions generated by the practitioners in the field and by the BER scholars in the field. And so what we did is, this is pre-COVID, back when we were in person, we surveyed the SABR, so the Society for Advancement of Biology Education Research plenary conference. And we surveyed individuals there and we had a pretty high response rate. And we want to acknowledge that there's limitations from surveying from one conference. We want to acknowledge that the SABR participants might not be representative of our whole community. But this was done as a convenient sampling to try and get a breadth of people there to see what they perceived as the direction of the field. And in this survey, we asked participants a number of questions. First, we asked, how would you define biology education research? Second, a similar question, what do you view as the purpose of BER? Then we had two parallel questions asking about their perceptions of scholarship, scholarly work in BER. The first question asked about the present, asked about what they saw as currently being done in BER. And the second question asked, what did they perceive as important areas for BER, for we as a community to pursue in the future? So current work and then what they thought would be important in the future. We had a number of people read through these. These were free response questions. And when you read through free response questions, you can find emergent themes, and we could do something called coding, and we had high inter-rater reliability. So first, I want to share the data for the question that asked respondents, what do you view as BER? What do you view as the definition of biology education research? And we see that most respondents view the field as being defined, unsurprisingly, by biology. The name biology is in the title of BER, learning, and classroom practices. So let me walk you through these data here. So let me start by looking at part A here, where my mouse is. In part A, on the left-hand side, we see the percent of codes. So percent of themes out of all the themes that respondents mentioned. We see these are the largest slices of the pie, are the most major, the most common themes here. And on the right-hand side is the percent of respondents who said that theme. So for example, we see that 80% of respondents mentioned BER was defined by biology. And likewise, we see since each respondent could reply with more than one theme, we saw that biology was over about a third of the themes related to biology. But what I want to draw your attention to is, again, this idea of defining BER, biology, learning, classroom. All three of those really emerge as the main themes of how our community were perceiving this field. And that aligned with our top-down expectations. We know that BER is grounded in biology, and we know that BER initially was centered around learning and improving learning. And we saw that same theme emerge in the second question. When we asked our respondents, what do you view as the purpose or goal of biology education research? And the most common response was that BER is about improving teaching and learning, about improving classroom instructional approaches, about promoting learning, student learning in those settings. And this again aligned with those top-down characterizations that Stanley shared. The characterizations that professional societies and that we see in the published work in BER. And so here we see another piece of data. I'm going to draw your attention here to the right-hand side. We see that, again, most respondents mentioned teaching, learning, and biology as the most common themes for the purpose or goal of BER. Perhaps the more interesting theme that emerged here was when we compared and asked respondents what they viewed as the current work in biology education research. And then we compared that to when we asked them, what do you view as the scholarship that needs to be done, that should be done in BER in the future? For current work, we see that the plurality of respondents really perceived current scholarship still focusing on these classroom teaching and learning. So focusing on what we call classroom interventions, changes in the classroom to promote student learning, and assessment of these changes, assessment of student learning and related outcomes, things like metacognition, thinking about thinking, persistence, and retention in the field. So we see most respondents view the field still doing work in these areas. But when we asked what respondents view as the next steps for the field, what they viewed as the future scholarship, what direction should BER pursue as a community in later years, we saw that respondents identified a different set of themes. Respondents mentioned that they thought we as a community, as the BER community, needed to diversify our research approaches. For example, a number of participants mentioned that we as a community needed to diversify our research approach by studying more mechanisms of learning. So rather than just assessing, did this work or not, looking at actually how do students learn? Why did this lead to improvement in learning? Likewise, respondents mentioned that they viewed a need to focus on a more diverse set of populations. And we know from the past work that Stanley and colleagues did that the vast majority of papers in BER really focus on one subset of students, that of four-year students at large research-intensive universities. And so there's this really pressing need to continue expanding our field, to be more inclusive, to really examine and include more student voices, those from two-year universities, those from transfer students going from two-year universities or other universities transferring in to new universities. And likewise, many respondents also mentioned the need to have larger longitudinal studies beyond the single course. And we know from that past work Stanley and colleagues did that most BER work is centered around looking at one intervention, one change in one course. Far fewer studies compare and track students throughout their career. And so respondents saw this need to, again, expand our study populations, be more inclusive, and really have this broader work that includes more students. And finally, participants, saw a need to pursue more work that would promote greater inclusivity in the classroom and outside the classroom for students in biology classes. And so based off these findings, based off comparing what respondents perceived as current work versus what they perceived as where we need to go in the future, we were able to come up with some suggestions for us as a community to really think about in terms of how we move forward as a community. First, given that most respondents saw work as limited to one class and saw a need for larger sample sizes, we recommend that we as a community really think about how we can support expanding research approaches, how we can support colleagues in a diversity of different institutions to pursue BER if they're interested, to now include more study populations, to be more inclusive, and to pursue more interdisciplinary work that really merges together different discipline-based education research fields and our colleagues in education. Likewise, to continue expanding our study populations, to fund and pursue provide resources for colleagues that can now incorporate voices of those who are at these two-year universities, transfer students, and to support instructors at two-year institutions. And finally, we want to echo recent calls to continue as a society pursuing work that really examines these critical issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And I want to turn it back over to Stanley, who will highlight one of these things. You heard about this earlier, about one way that he and Saber are trying to support these calls to try and support a more inclusive group of people doing biology education research.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. And also, this is just to reiterate what Rachel has already said in the beginning, especially for those who might have other commitments and were joining us a little late. ASM and Saber have a co-sponsored set of webinars in a biology education research course that would hopefully help everyone to get the skills that one would need to kickstart your biology education research project. And more information was already posted in the chat, but I think we can, Rachel is much faster on the chat than I am. So thank you. And I think, Jeremy, this is all we have sort of in the formal prepared portion of today's discussion. We're happy to open this up for questions and chat and answer any sort of remaining inquiries that you may have. So thank you.
Thank you for that overview of your paper. While people are thinking about their questions, and please, audience members, put your questions into the Q&A box, and you do have the option to ask it anonymously. Can I ask both of you, either one can start, can you talk a little bit about how you got involved in this field and talk about your transition away from maybe where you were trained as a doctoral student or your postdoc and how you got to where you are doing biology education research?
Sure. Do you want to start, Stanley, or do you want me to start with that?
Well, go ahead. You're already unmuted. So
Okay, sounds good. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for that, Rachel. So my career is in grad school. I became really interested in teaching, and I remember loving my first TA experience. And I remember one of my mentors handed me this book, Scientific Teaching by Joe Handelsman and colleagues. And to me, it was a really mind-blowing idea of, hey, there's evidence and studies that look at how we teach, that there's evidence-based practices supporting instructional decisions. And I became really interested in that. I started reading a lot of papers. I joined our university's Center for Teaching and Learning, our CTL, and we had some reading groups, some communities, and it was really fascinating reading through these papers. And I started dabbling in BER in grad school, where I learned from a friend and mentor there, and I was participating in one of my first studies in grad school. I pursued a teaching career afterward. So my current position is as an instructional faculty where I teach. But throughout my career as instructional faculty, I've still remained really interested and involved in BER. And I've been lucky enough to be able to participate in some of these studies and lead some of these studies. And I'm excited that I'm transitioning more in the BER field starting next year. My position is actually changing. We'll have more responsibilities in the BER field and more time to pursue those questions in BER. So it's been this gradual transition going from starting as a teacher, and I'm still really excited about teaching, and I'm still motivated by how to improve teaching. And now I'm able to help participate and lead some of these studies that look at teaching and help support teaching and help answer these questions. Thanks, and I'll let Stanley jump in as well.
yeah, and I think I probably have a fairly similar trajectory. I was, originally trained as a biochemist, although throughout my career, I've always been interested in teaching and education. In fact, I taught high school for a few years right out of college before I went back to get my PhD. And then after that, I was initially looking for faculty positions at primarily undergraduate institutions such as liberal arts colleges, where I could continue to do some biochemistry research and also really engage with students both in the classroom and in the laboratory. At that time, there was this really interesting grant-funded position that I noticed and I applied. So a lot of this trajectory change that towards what I'm currently doing was really by serendipity, where I ended up in this position at Northwestern, where I spent about 4 years in higher education research, thinking about curriculum development and also institutional change. And that's where I got started really in biology and science education research, and gradually continue to be involved and ended up where I am now in my current position.
Thank you for sharing. I always ask our speakers that question at JMBE Live, and nobody has the same answer. And it's great to see the diversity of career paths that people have taken to get to where they are, where they publish a research article in JMBE. It's fascinating for me to see. I have one question that came through, and I'll go ahead and pose the question and answer it because it's about the course, and then we'll enter some questions about your content. One person asked about the upcoming biology education research course, and they asked what happens if you have to miss a couple of live webinars. And so there are 7 live webinars for our course, and if you miss any of them, it's no problem. They're all going to be recorded, and you can watch the recording through our learning management system. And of course, our webinar leaders are more than available to help answer any questions that you might have missed. So you can feel free to contact me for more information if you have follow-up questions. Okay, next question for our speaker. They really enjoyed this talk, so they wanted to compliment you, and they have the question. How do you discuss in research classes with a very large number of students in your class? Do you prepare some kind of question and answer sheets? Or I think this person is asking, have you ever done a study surveying, say, a classroom intervention with a very large class? And what are some typical ways that you've seen people go about that?
So I'll start, but Stanley should jump in because I think you've done more studies with larger number of students. Chapman is a smaller institution in terms of class size and number of students than UCSD. And I know, Stanley, you've done some broader work here. But in terms of surveying students and their participation, I think the first thing to mention is I remember the first piece of advice I got when thinking about biology education research and how to measure interventions was always reach out to your IRB office and talk to them, get their advice, get their feedback, and make sure you get permission before you run a study. And for our classes, to measure intervention, we want to be very careful to make sure that you're not coercing students into participating. So we work with the IRB office to get approval for that. We often will survey anonymously, and we will often partner with our colleagues too to have a control group and a study group and have some kind of comparison to expand our study population. But Stanley, do you want to add on to that? I know you've worked with some large classes at UCSD as well, some broader studies as well.
Yeah, thank you. And I think, this may sound a little bit old-fashioned, and this was probably true pre-COVID times. Sometimes we found that if we did sort of paper survey in class, right? So if you go into a classroom and students are already there and you're collaborating with the instructor of the course, where you can get some dedicated class time for students to fill out the survey, right, where they are already there in place. We've also done this where increasingly students have devices with them, either, cell phones, tablets, or computers, right? So we've also done some version of this where we go into class where, again, there's dedicated class time where people can pull out their computer and fill out their survey. In terms of thinking about what kinds of incentives right, for example, incentives versus coercion, right, as Jeremy was saying, I think that is something that getting guidance from your institutional review board at your campus will be really great, because I think there's always different local context and culture and history that is important to take into account.
And I'll just jump in here too, that I found that if you explain the purpose or motivation of a study for students, for example, I often tell students, your responses are really valuable, they'll help us improve this class or biology education in the future. I think that does make students take it more seriously, and they know that their responses are helpful and will lead to change.
So one of our attendees asked, if you were to do studies in reverse order and know the results from a CBE study or a survey before doing BER, would your approach change? Do you need more information?
So I'm still trying to process the question. Stanley, do you want to start off with this one while I process?
Yeah, I'm trying to think about the question as well. So,
But I reach out to the asker and
yeah,
find more
maybe
information.
that would help. But I think the two approaches are really complementary. I'm not sure if the overall approach would necessarily change, because what we're doing is really, right, surveying the voices of people in the field and perhaps comparing it with what is published or what are the guidelines and goals of professional societies and journals. I think perhaps some of the detailed analysis might be a little bit different. We might have, considered how we would, ask slightly different questions or combine the analysis in ways where the codes and themes might be more shared across, across the different studies.
Does that help? Got to clarify. You also did a CBE survey, so cell biology education survey of research on BER. If you knew that beforehand, how would it affect how you approach the JMBE study that you talked about today? Does that help?
Yeah, I'll build off what Stanley was sharing there. I think our survey was very general. It was constrained by having to fill it out on paper and pencil in a couple minutes before the plenary session, excuse me. But I think what the question's asking is, what would we potentially change in our study? And I think there's probably room for some more detailed questions if we didn't have these constraints of having people fill it out on the spot, where, for example, we didn't necessarily ask what areas have you published in? Do you have a research group that you're doing? What areas are you working on? And so this was a very general snapshot of the audience at that one point in time. And I think that looking back, if we had a fewer of these constraints, we probably could have expanded and asked more questions and dived into this a little bit deeper. But our goal was really to have this one snapshot to include everyone's voices who were participating at that time.
Thanks so much. Okay. What suggestions do you have for educators who want to transition completely into education research after several years of doing bench work biology?
You want me to start again, Stanley?
Yeah, I think you were more recent, so I think that's
Okay, yeah.
right.
So my advice is to reach out to people, and I know Stanley and I would be happy to talk to any of you. I can put my email in the chat if you ever want to follow up. Let me put my email, and Stanley, feel free to put your email if I'm volunteering your email. But I know that everyone here, what I found is that BER is such a welcoming, inclusive community. And that's my advice is I reached out to a lot of people. I asked them questions. I asked them about their career paths. I've learned a lot from working with Stanley, who has been in the field longer than I have, and I've learned and gained from his expertise and experience. I've talked to other people in the field, and I just started attending as many conferences as I could. And it's a relatively small field where you'll start seeing the same people at these conferences, and you start to knowing them. Everyone's super friendly, and just talking to them and just diving in. I think my advice would be dive in, think of a question. And it sounds like the ASM workshop series will have you work you through identifying a question, and diving in and doing it is really the best way to get started. So I would say my advice is reach out. We're such an inclusive, welcoming community. I hope we are. And jump in and get started. And then work with your mentors, work with your colleagues to work on that and build off of that. Stanley, you want to address anything else there?
Yeah, I would agree. I think it's a great community to be in, and in my experience, I've had a lot of opportunities early on where colleagues are very willing to work together and provide mentorship. So this is something that I think, just as Jeremy said, right, definitely reach out to, to me, to Jeremy, to probably, right, the colleagues leading the biology education research course, and then, anyone else who you might be meeting at conferences or authors of papers that you're reading.
I'll jump into that. My understanding, and Stanley, jump in if I'm mischaracterizing anything, is that most people in BER transition from the discipline, meaning their background is in biology, whether that's bench work or theoretical work or other aspects of biology, into BER. Most people end up doing that path. Far fewer start off as an education path or have a BER, PhD in BER or education, although we've seen increasing number of that. And so I mentioned that to point out that you're not alone if you want to make this transition, that my understanding is most people in the BER community have made a similar transition. And Stanley, jump in if I'm mischaracterizing anything here.
I've seen that as well. Majority of people start as bench work or field work or lab work scientists. But there are a lot more people coming up. A lot of the trainees are getting a PhD, say in microbiology education, right? So that might be a part of their training. Okay, this question is from Stanley Malloy, and he's the JMBE editor-in-chief. Stanley says, I was a bit surprised by the differences between the perspectives of the present versus the future BER research needs. Although there are still lots of studies focused on a single class being published right now, it seems to me that there's a lot of great current work that's focused on broader concepts and addressing diversity and inclusion, and some studies also connections between classes and instead of focus on a single class. Do your personal perceptions agree with the survey perspectives on this issue?
Stanley, you want to start? I've been doing a lot of starting. You want to start?
Yeah, sure. And I agree. I think, in as many of we know, right, research and publishing take a little bit of time. So I believe there is a little bit of lag time from when the survey was administered to the paper actually coming out, right? And so I think you're correct in that, some of the future work or future has really become, emerging trends in areas and topics that people have put in increasing efforts in recent years. And so I think this is right good, a reassuring indicator, right, that the perspectives of even just surveying attendees at one conference, right, seem to be fairly accurate in sort of predicting and being aligned with the emerging work that the community is pursuing together. So that's and I think increasingly, especially in work related to diversity, equity, and inclusion and social justice, right? That has perhaps coincided with a variety of global events in the past few years, right? That has come together in ways that I think is going to be tremendously important and for the community to work together moving forward.
And to add on to that, thanks, Stanley. Another piece of data that I've been thinking about is I serve on the SABR keynote committee, where we're responsible for surveying the SABR community and asking what topics, what areas are you most interested in for the keynote speaker for SABR. And I think what we've seen on those surveys for the past, this is my second year, second or third year on the committee, I believe second year on the committee, reflects what we saw from our work here, where there's a lot of demand or people mentioning want to hear more about these issues of justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion as well. And I think, as what Stanley mentioned, recent events have really precipitated this urgency to address these issues. And so we're really excited to hopefully see our community continue pursuing these really important questions in the future.
Don't have any more questions coming up. So folks can feel free to put them into the Q&A box. We have a couple more minutes left. One thing I will remind people, I just put a link into the chat of JMBE Live's YouTube playlist. So this is JMBE Live is a monthly series of free webinars, and we record them and post them to our JMBE Live playlist. And now we have a nice collection over the last 2 years, about a dozen or so videos that are freely available on the YouTube channel. And feel free to take a watch of what you might have missed from previous content. The other two things I'll bring to your attention. The ASMQ is coming up. It's a completely online virtual conference this year, July 13th to 15th, and registration is now open. And there's a link in the chat. You can go learn more about this conference. And new this year, if you're at a 2-year school or a minority serving institution in the United States, we encourage you to come to ASMQ. We have registration scholarships for people that are currently teaching at those types of institutions. So please do look at that opportunity and apply by the end of April if you are interested in a scholarship. And we do have our next JMBE Live on May the 6th. It's in about 4 weeks, and go ahead and go learn about that and go learn about the event and get yourself registered so you can join us here again.